1896 photograph looks serene until you see what's hidden in the child's eyes. Dr. Sarah Mitchell had spent 20 years examining photographs at the National Archives in Washington, D.C., but nothing had prepared her for what she was about to find on that humid August morning in 2019. The photograph arrived in a donation box from an estate sale in Jackson, Mississippi. A simple family portrait dated 1896, mounted on deteriorating cardboard with a photographer's stamp, barely visible in the corner. The image showed a black family of 4, standing in front of a wooden house with a peaked roof. The father stood tall on the left, his hand resting protectively on the shoulder of a boy who couldn't have been more than 10. The mother sat in a chair, her posture rigid and dignified, wearing a high-collared dress with delicate buttons. Between them stood a girl of about 8 years old, her small hands clasped in front of her pristine white pinafore. Sarah almost filed it away with the hundreds of other 19th century portraits that crossed her desk each month. Almost. But something about the girl's expression stopped her. While the other family members maintained the neutral, slightly stiff poses typical of the era's long exposure times, the child's eyes held an intensity that seemed to pierce through more than a century of silence. She pulled her magnifying glass closer, studying the girl's face. The eyes were wide, unflinching, staring directly into the camera lens with an expression that Sarah couldn't quite identify. Not fear exactly, but something close to it. Determination mixed with sorrow. A knowledge that seemed far too heavy for such young shoulders. The photograph's condition was remarkably good considering its age. The sepia tones had faded only slightly, and the details remained sharp enough that Sarah could make out the texture of the wooden planks behind the family, the individual buttons on the mother's dress, even the slight tremor in the boy's hand where it rested against his leg. Sarah logged the photograph into the archive system, noting the date, the presumed location, and the photographer's partially legible stamp. Stone Studio, Jackson, Miss. She attached it to the scanning queue for high-resolution digitization, a routine procedure that would allow researchers to examine the image in far greater detail than any magnifying glass could provide. She had no idea that this routine cataloging would lead to one of the most shocking discoveries in American historical documentation, a secret hidden in plain sight for over 120 years. 3 weeks later, Sarah received the high-resolution scan on her computer. The archives used state-of-the-art equipment capable of capturing details invisible to the naked eye, magnifying images up to 50 times their original size without losing clarity. She had scheduled an hour to examine the photograph properly, making notes for the permanent record about clothing styles, architectural details, and any other historical information the image might contain. She began systematically zooming in on different sections of the photograph. The father's weathered hand suggested a life of manual labor. The mother's dress, though simple, showed careful mending and pressing. Pride maintained despite obvious poverty. The house behind them was modest, but sturdy, with a small window visible to the right of the family. Then, Sarah zoomed in on the girl's face and her breath caught in her throat. At 50 times magnification, the child's eyes revealed something that shouldn't have been possible to capture in 1896. The corneas acted as tiny mirrors, reflecting the scene in front of the camera with startling clarity. Sarah could make out the vague shape of the photographer behind his equipment, the bright Mississippi sky above him, and something else that made her hands tremble as she adjusted the image contrast. In the reflection of the girl's left eye, barely visible but unmistakable once you knew to look for it, were several human figures in the background, and they were carrying something long and metallic that caught the light. Chains, heavy iron chains, the kind used for shackles. Sarah zoomed in further, her heart pounding. The figures were blurred, but the chains were clear enough. This photograph, taken in 1896, 31 years after the 13th Amendment abolished slavery, contained evidence of people being held in chains in broad daylight. She sat back from her monitor, her mind racing. This couldn't be an accident. The family was positioned deliberately, the girl staring directly at the camera with that haunting intensity. They knew. They wanted someone to see this, to find this evidence hidden in a child's eyes. Sarah printed the magnified section and placed it next to the original scan. The discovery demanded investigation. Sarah knew she couldn't pursue this alone. She needed expertise in post-Civil War Southern history, photographic analysis, and Mississippi's legal records from the 1890s. She began by contacting Dr. James Patterson, a historian at the University of Mississippi who had published extensively on Reconstruction and its aftermath in the Deep South. When she sent him the magnified image, his response came within hours. "My God, where did you find this? Can you come to Oxford?" 5 days later, Sarah sat in James's cramped office surrounded by towers of books and archival boxes. He had cleared his desk to spread out enlarged prints of the photograph, along with maps of Mississippi from 1896 and legal documents regarding labor practices in the post-Reconstruction South. "What you found," James said, adjusting his glasses as he studied the image, "is evidence of something historians have known about theoretically but rarely seen documented so explicitly. After Reconstruction ended in 1877, Southern states found ways to essentially re-enslave black Americans through convict leasing, sharecropping debt, and what they called apprenticeship systems. He pulled out a document from one of his boxes. Look at this. Mississippi's 1890 Constitution. They created laws specifically designed to criminalize black life. Vagrancy laws, pig laws, laws against insulting gestures. A black man could be arrested for not having a job, then leased to a plantation or a lumber company to work off his fine in chains. Sarah examined the chains visible in the photograph's reflection. But this is 1896. Wouldn't there have been oversight? Federal enforcement? James laughed bitterly. Federal troops withdrew from the South in 1877. By 1896, the North had essentially abandoned black Southerners to their fate. What you're looking at in this photograph is the reality that thousands lived but few could safely document. They began researching Jackson, Mississippi in 1896, looking for any records of the family. The photographer's stamp gave them their first real lead. Livingston Studio had operated on Capitol Street in downtown Jackson from 1893 to 1901. Sarah spent 2 weeks in Jackson, working through records at the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. The city's 1896 directory listed dozens of black families, but without surnames from the photograph, finding the right one seemed impossible. She searched through property records, tax documents, and business licenses, looking for any family matching the composition: mother, father, daughter, and son. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A local genealogist named Thomas Reed, who had been helping his own family trace their roots, heard about Sarah's research through the archives staff. He arrived one afternoon with a worn leather journal that had been passed down through his family for generations. "My great-great-grandfather worked as a porter at the train station in Jackson," Thomas explained, carefully opening the journal. He kept detailed notes about everything he witnessed. He wrote about a family, the Washingtons, who lived on Lynch Street, just north of downtown. Sarah's pulse quickened as Thomas read aloud from an entry dated July 1896. "Saw Joseph Washington today at the station. His hands still bear marks from the work. He told me his daughter Mary asked him why the men in the camps wore chains if slavery was over. He had no answer to give her that wouldn't break both their hearts. Joseph Washington, a daughter named Mary." Sarah cross-referenced the name with property records and found a deed registration. Joseph Washington, carpenter, had purchased a small lot on Lynch Street in 1894. The address matched the area where similar houses from the photograph's era still stood, but what sealed the identification was a newspaper clipping Thomas had also brought. A small advertisement from the Jackson Daily Clarion, August 1896. "Family photograph services, reduced rates this week only. Livingston Studio, Capitol Street." The timeline aligned perfectly. Joseph Washington had scraped together enough money to own a small piece of property, a monumental achievement for a black man in 1896 Mississippi. And in that moment of pride, he had taken his family to have their portrait made. But the photograph served a dual purpose: documentation of their dignity and evidence of the horrors still unfolding around them. Finding Mary Washington's story required piecing together fragments from multiple sources. Census records showed her listed in the 1900 census as a 14-year-old living with her parents and brother on Lynch Street. But it was a collection of letters discovered in a trunk at the Mississippi State Archives that truly brought her voice to life. The letters were part of a correspondence between Mary and a Quaker teacher named Elizabeth Morris, who had come to Jackson in 1898 to help establish a school for black children. The first letter, written in careful, practiced handwriting, was dated October 1898. "Dear Miss Morris, thank you for teaching me to write properly. My father says education is a light that nobody can extinguish, even when they try to keep us in darkness." Sarah sat in the reading room, carefully turning the brittle pages. Over 3 years of correspondence, Mary wrote about her daily life, her studies, her hopes of becoming a teacher herself. But scattered throughout were references that made the photograph's hidden message devastatingly clear. In a letter from March 1899, Mary wrote, "Today I saw Mr. Johnson being taken away by the sheriff. His crime was arguing about wages owed to him. Mother says he will be sent to the camps where they work the men until they die. She says we must be careful never to give them reason to take father." Another letter from November 1899 was even more explicit. "Miss Morris, you asked why I seem frightened when we discuss freedom in class. I will tell you what I cannot say aloud in school. Freedom is a word that sounds beautiful but tastes like ash in our mouths. Men are still worked in chains here. Women still live in fear. The law protects us on paper but persecutes us in practice. I am 12 years old and I have already learned that truth and legality are not the same thing." The letters revealed a brilliant, observant child who understood far more than adults might have expected, and they confirmed what Sarah had suspected. The photograph was no accident. Mary Washington, at 8 years old, had stood perfectly still for that long exposure, staring into the camera lens, knowing that somewhere in the future, someone might look closely enough to see what was reflected in her eyes. Dr. Patterson joined Sarah and Jackson, and together they began documenting the broader system that Mary's photograph had captured. Mississippi's convict leasing program was officially legal in 1896, a brutal system where the state leased prisoners, overwhelmingly black men arrested on trivial charges, to private companies for labor. The state archives contained contracts between Mississippi and lumber companies, railroad corporations, and plantation owners. Men convicted of vagrancy or breach of contract were leased for terms ranging from months to years, forced to work in conditions that often proved fatal. The companies paid the state a fee per prisoner, and the state bore no responsibility for the workers' welfare. James found death records that told a horrifying story. Between 1890 and 1900, hundreds of black men died while in convict lease camps throughout Mississippi. Causes of death were listed vaguely: fever, exhaustion, accident. But testimonies from survivors, recorded decades later during Depression-era interviews, described beatings, starvation, and working conditions designed to extract maximum labor before inevitable death. What made Mary's photograph extraordinary was its capture of the transportation moment. The chains visible in her eye's reflection showed prisoners being moved, likely from the Jackson jail to a work camp. This happened in broad daylight, on public streets, so normalized that photographers set up their equipment just blocks away. Sarah found records of the camps nearest to Jackson in 1896. The Eastman Lumber Company operated a camp 15 miles north of the city, leasing an average of 40 prisoners at a time. The Yazoo Mississippi Delta Railroad Company leased another 60 for track-laying work. These men wore chains during transport and often while working, despite the 13th Amendment's explicit prohibition of slavery and involuntary servitude except as punishment for crime. The legal loophole was devastatingly simple. Arrest black men on fabricated or exaggerated charges, convict them in sham trials, then lease them as punishment for crime. The system was slavery in everything but name, maintained through legal fiction and violent enforcement, and the Washington family had documented it, hiding the evidence in plain sight. Understanding why Joseph Washington took such an enormous risk required examining what life was like for black families trying to maintain dignity and safety in 1896 Mississippi. Sarah interviewed descendants of families who had lived in Jackson during that era, and a clearer picture emerged of the impossible choices people faced. Thomas Reed introduced Sarah to his aunt, Dorothy Reed, 92 years old, whose grandmother had known the Washington family. Dorothy's memory was sharp, and she had heard stories passed down through 3 generations. My grandmother said Joseph Washington was a proud man, but not foolish, Dorothy explained, sitting in her living room, surrounded by family photographs spanning a century. He had learned carpentry during slavery and used those skills to earn money after freedom came. He saved everything, kept his head down, avoided trouble. But he also had a conscience that wouldn't let him stay silent. According to Dorothy's grandmother, Joseph had witnessed a young man named Samuel being arrested outside the carpenter's shop where Joseph worked. Samuel's crime was standing on a street corner without visible employment. The police took him away, and 3 months later, Samuel's mother received notification that her son had died of fever at a lumber camp. Joseph knew it could have been him, Dorothy said. One wrong word, one white man taking offense, one accusation he couldn't defend against, and he'd be in chains too. But he also knew that if good people said nothing, did nothing, left no record, then the truth would die with them. The photograph was Joseph's act of resistance. He had saved for months to afford the sitting at Livingston Studio. He had chosen the timing carefully, a day when prisoners were being transported along Capitol Street. He had positioned his family in front of their own house, a symbol of their achievement and autonomy, while making sure the camera angle would capture the reflection of bondage in his daughter's eyes. Mary had understood the assignment. At 8 years old, she stood absolutely still, eyes wide open, staring unflinchingly at the lens for the full exposure time, ensuring that the reflection would be captured with maximum clarity. As Sarah and James dug deeper, they discovered that the Washington family wasn't acting alone. Evidence suggested a network of black families and allies who were documenting injustices through whatever means they could manage: letters, photographs, preserved newspapers, testimony hidden in church records. Elizabeth Morris's teaching correspondence revealed that she was part of a Quaker network that collected evidence of post-Reconstruction abuses. In a letter to her sister in Philadelphia, dated 1899, Morris wrote, "The families here are braver than I ever imagined possible. They document what they can, when they can, knowing the danger. Young Mary brought me a photograph last week that made me weep. I have sent a copy to the Anti-Slavery Society, though I fear nothing will come of it." Sarah tracked down the Anti-Slavery Society's records, now held at Boston University. There, in a box marked Southern Testimonies, 1895-1900, she found a copy of the Washington family photograph, along with a letter from Elizabeth Morris describing what Mary's eyes reflected. The Society had received dozens of similar pieces of evidence: photographs, written testimonies, physical artifacts. They had compiled reports, sent delegations to Washington, pleaded with congressmen and senators to investigate. But the North's political will to protect black Southerners had evaporated. The evidence was filed away, and the abuses continued. What made the Washington photograph unique was that it survived with its context intact. Most of the other evidence had been separated from its explanatory documentation over the decades, leaving just images or testimonies without the full story. But Mary's continued correspondence with Morris, preserved by Morris's family, provided the narrative thread that made the photograph's purpose undeniable. James found one more crucial piece, a notation in Elizabeth Morris's diary from September 1896. Joseph Washington came to the school today. He told me he had taken precautions to ensure the photograph would be preserved, even if something happened to his family. He said Mary made him promise that the truth would not die with them. I have never met a braver 8-year-old child. By early 2020, Sarah and James had compiled their findings into a comprehensive report documenting the Washington family's courageous act of resistance. The photograph and its context were featured in a special exhibition at the National Archives titled Hidden Witnesses: Documentary Resistance in Post-Reconstruction America. News of the discovery spread quickly. Descendants of the Washington family, scattered across the country, began reaching out to Sarah. Among them was Dr. Michelle Washington, a civil rights attorney in Chicago, who had known she was related to the Jackson Washingtons, but had never seen the photograph. My great-grandfather was Mary's younger brother, the boy in the picture, Michelle explained when she visited the archives. Family stories said that Mary became a teacher and devoted her life to education and justice, but we never knew about this photograph or what it contained. Through Michelle, Sarah learned the rest of Mary's story. After Elizabeth Morris left Mississippi in 1901, Mary continued her education through correspondence courses and eventually attended a teaching college established by the Freedmen's Bureau. She taught in rural Mississippi schools for 40 years, retiring in 1948. She never married, dedicating herself entirely to education. Mary had kept her own copy of the family photograph, and before she died in 1962, she had written on the back in her careful handwriting, "My father taught me that silence is survival, but documentation is resistance. This picture is not just our family, it is testimony." The photograph now represents more than one family's courage. Historians have used it as a starting point to research other instances of documentary resistance, finding patterns of families who found ways to record the truth despite enormous risk. Churches that maintained death records contradicting official accounts, newspapers that published veiled references to abuses, photographers who deliberately captured background details that told larger stories. Sarah published her research in the Journal of American History, and James incorporated the findings into his next book about post-Reconstruction Mississippi. But both agreed that the most important outcome was ensuring that Mary Washington's act of witness was finally recognized and understood. The exhibition at the National Archives drew thousands of visitors in its first months. People stood in front of the Washington family photograph for long minutes, studying the faces, reading the detailed explanation of what Mary's eyes reflected, understanding the layers of courage required to create such evidence. For Sarah, the project had become deeply personal. She arranged for a historical marker to be placed on Lynch Street in Jackson, near where the Washington house had stood. The dedication ceremony in June 2020 brought together descendants, historians, community members, and students from the school that now stood a few blocks from the original location. Michelle Washington spoke at the ceremony, her voice steady but emotional. "My great-great-grandfather Joseph bought a piece of land and built a house to prove that black families could own property, could build something permanent, could claim dignity in a world designed to deny it. My great-great-aunt Mary stood before a camera and stared into the future, trusting that someone would eventually see what she saw, understand what she understood, and tell the truth she risked everything to preserve." The marker's inscription read, "Here stood the home of Joseph and Rachel Washington and their children Mary and Samuel. In 1896, they created a family photograph that documented both their dignity and the continued bondage of black Americans in post-emancipation Mississippi. Their courage in preserving evidence of injustice serves as a testament to all who resist oppression through truth." Sarah kept a copy of the photograph on her office wall, Mary's intense gaze a daily reminder of why historical work mattered. Every document she cataloged, every photograph she examined, might contain another hidden truth waiting to be discovered. The Washington family's story changed how archivists and historians approached 19th century photographs. Institutions began systematically examining images at high magnification, looking for details that might have been deliberately included as testimony. Several more examples of documentary resistance emerged, each adding to the historical record of how people fought against injustice with whatever tools they had. Mary Washington had been right. The truth hadn't died with them. It had waited, patient and persistent, hidden in a child's eyes, for someone to look closely enough to see.